The next speaker for you, and the last individual speaker before we break for our presentation by the panel and then the chance for your questions to be answered, is somebody for whom I don't need any notes to introduce at all. And the reason is because Tim Lynch joined our office in 2002, and I was responsible for selecting Tim to join at that point what was the #1 priority area here in the Western New York area, and that was counterterrorism. And all of you know the challenges that we had in post 9/11. And Tim was one of the leading prosecutors when it came to fighting that particular challenge. In 2009, when President Obama named me to be your United States Attorney, I had to select my upper management division. And I was fortunate to have in J.P. Kennedy somebody who could be the executive officer, if you will, as first assistant. And if you haven't met J.P., you will. Joe Guerra had been our narcotics division chief, and I asked him to run our criminal division. We have civil, we have criminal. But really the most important division within our criminal program, and the one that prosecutes the most numbers of cases statistically, numerically, they use all the techniques that Congress has given us, is the narcotics division. And in picking Tim Lynch to be our narcotics division chief, I just could not have had a better person available, because Tim's everything we want and everything you deserve as an assistant United States attorney and now as a supervisor. He's discerning, he's sensitive in the ways you need your law enforcers to be, like so many of the law enforcement officers here are, but he's very, very smart and he's very, very tough. And that's exactly what we're looking for, and that's what Tim's going to talk about, how we prosecute in the United States Attorney's Office this particular type of crime. Tim?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Bill, for those kind words. I appreciate it. One thing is I'm sure of as I stand up here today at 2 o'clock now, several speakers, following several speakers, including Dr. Updike, that probably I play the smallest role in, I think, this problem that really has taken a grip on our community, because we can't arrest our way, prosecute our way out of this problem. The problem is much deeper than that. I know from experience as a child that addiction is a serious problem. Divides families, breaks them apart. And I know that even when there's law enforcement action in those families, it doesn't make a difference. So I come not only from that perspective, as seeing it as a child, knowing that it doesn't make a difference, that my role is very small. And I appreciate all the work that our treatment providers do, that our families do, because those are the people that are going to make the change in our community. I've been to a lot of meetings. I've gone to AA meetings. I've gone to support group meetings, and I've seen it. So when Samantha stood up today and her family and Mr. Israel, it really, I see it. And I just want you to know that it is important to me, because I am not just a prosecutor. I'm a person, a caring person who cares about people. It's been very difficult to sit here and watch the stories or hear them. So I want you to know that I don't come from a person who just wants to prosecute the problem. But I think I also want to pick up on where Dr. Updike left off this morning. And I think in our meetings, as we led up to this, Dr. Updike, I think, expressed some concern about, the liability for medical professionals, where their liability is, and do we understand the problem that they have, that they're just trying to do their job. So I think that's really where I've tailored my remarks here today, the limited time that I have, just talking to those medical professionals and letting them know that we're not tracking them down, as Mr. Kasperzak said, it's not a witch hunt. That's not what it is. But rest assured, if your case or your name comes across my desk, we are going to aggressively and vigorously and use every tool we can to prosecute you. And if death results because of your actions as a medical professional, we are going to use every tool that we have to put you away for a significant period of time. I want to start really by saying, obviously we for the most part, operate in two different spheres. Criminal law, obviously I don't have a lot of contact with the medical field on a regular basis, and I doubt most doctors think on any particular day that they're going to cross paths with me or the DEA. But there is a small segment of the medical community that unfortunately overlaps with criminal law because they're violating the oath they took, and they're violating the federal drug laws. Now, for 90 years, as Mr. Updike said, 1914 was the first act by Congress in which we attempted to regulate the distribution of narcotics. And most recently, in 2006, the Supreme Court said this is not an act by Congress to regulate medicine. But what we are regulating is when doctors cross the line between providing assistance to patients, when they become what, in essence, is a street dealer on any corner in the city of Buffalo or on our suburbs, you're a drug pusher. That's what you are. And if you are doing that, we're going to prosecute you. What is the responsibility of physicians? There's no doubt that what's placed upon them is a responsibility to distribute drugs wisely and within the course of their medical practice. Medical professionals, what does that include? Well, it includes everyone within that office practice. It includes the doctors. It includes the physician assistants. It includes the nurses. They can all be criminally prosecuted under the federal drug laws. Now, what is the law? What is unlawful about it? You cannot intentionally distribute or dispense a controlled substance. Now, that's a little more difficult, obviously, with a medical practitioner because they are licensed to dispense narcotics. So, in addition to the regular requirements we would have for people who are dealing heroin and cocaine, there's a third element that's required, that the person's actions were not for a legitimate medical purpose or they were outside the scope or beyond the bounds of medical practice. So I think when we sit here today and we say, well, where are we going to go? How can we solve this problem? I think part of it starts with Dr. Updike, the medical field in general. Are we going to raise the bar? Are we going to say that we're going to require more of doctors before they prescribe these serious pain or opiate pills? Are we going to require them to do more treatment, more education, before they continue to prescribe these pills to individuals who are, quite frankly, beating the system, they're abusing the drugs, and they're also taking a share of those drugs and going out on the street and selling those drugs? It's sort of like if I gave my kid my ATM card and a PIN number, I'm sure he'd run all over the city of Buffalo taking out my money. Be buying stuff, iPods, everything else, every PlayStation game you can dream of. Well, that's what narcotics users do. We talked about it before. They go to doctors, they continue to shop, and they continue to obtain narcotics that eventually makes their way onto the streets of Buffalo. And I have no doubt, especially with Dr. Updike and most of the doctors in this profession, 99% of them are doing exactly what they took an oath to do, which was treat their patients for pain and addiction, treat them for their medical problems. But the fact is, if they don't have all the information, if they can't know anything other than what the patient is telling them, we're going to continue to have this problem. And I'll come back 10 years from now and we'll have the same discussion. In 1970, when Congress passed or revised the Controlled Substances Act, I actually was doing some legislative history looking at it. Many of the senators' major concern was the diversion of legal narcotics. 1970, that's what they said on the floors of Congress. That's the reason why they revised the laws. Well, it's 41 years later, and we're now standing here today saying there's still an epidemic in this country, in this community, about the diversion of narcotics. Well, what is outside the scope of professional practice or not for a legitimate medical purpose? It's been very difficult to define in the case law only because it really is dependent on each state. What is required by the medical boards? What is required in the community as far as the dispensation of narcotics and for the reasons for dispensing those narcotics? So when I said that we really have to look back at the beginning of this presentation today and look back at what the doctors are doing, what education they have, how informed they are about the problem, that's really where it starts. It starts with the medical boards. What is going to be required? When Dr. Updike spoke this morning and talked about treatment plans and obviously the testing of urinalysis and so on and so forth, those are all great things, and I'm sure, and I know Dr. Updike does it in his practice. The question is everyone else doing it? We know that there are doctors out there who are prescribing narcotics that they probably shouldn't be doing, and they're not really informed as to the techniques used by drug addicts in order to obtain their narcotics. When we did the McCall case, as Dale Kasperzak said, I was rather shocked at the phone calls and the descriptions that were made over the phone, essentially advising these individuals how to dupe the doctors. It wasn't that difficult because they'd go and see the doctor, and the next day they'd have their 90 pills of OxyContin. Now, quite frankly, the examples of, I ran through the case law, the examples of what's not for a legitimate medical purpose, you know, I would doubt that anyone would have any difficulty identifying those cases as being outside the scope of medical practice. Quite frankly, they were amazing to see that any doctor would be doing these sorts of things. For instance, one physician, just all he prescribed was pain medication. He did nothing else. He was not a pain doctor. He was an internist, and all he was issuing was pain medication. Large numbers of prescriptions were issued. No physical examination or a cursory examination was performed. The doctor was seeing hundreds and hundreds of patients the same day. He was performing no examination. All he was doing was having them come into his office, providing them with the script, and sending the patient out the door. Now, again, those are the obvious cases. Physician warned the patient to go to different pharmacies and not have them filled all at the same place. Obviously, because the physician was concerned the pharmacist would realize what he was up to. One physician actually used the street slang for the drug that he was prescribing. Now, again, I know that that's not happening in 99% of the doctor's offices in our area, but it does happen. The last one I thought was most egregious. Not only were physicians turning asking for sexual favors, but in one instance, he was having patients do construction work at his house in exchange for narcotics. So again, those are the obvious cases. Those are the ones that are very difficult for everyone to identify, and those are obviously ones that we would take to court. But I guess as going forward, as I said, what we need to do is to raise the bar, because for us to prosecute these kinds of cases, for us to prosecute doctors and other medical professionals, we are relying on what the standard of care is in the community by doctors. And if that standard of care isn't raised, if the expectations aren't higher, we're not going to be in a position where we're going to be able to prosecute these unscrupulous doctors who really are only motivated by greed. Obviously, other aspects of their money obviously is the first thing, but in other instances it was sexual favors. So those are the situations that we will continue to work on. The other thing, which I didn't really know and I hadn't really thought of before, but the responsibility of the pharmacist. They play an independent role, and that independent role is one that we will continue to look at. They have a corresponding responsibility under federal law to make sure that that prescription was lawfully issued and for a lawful purpose. Congress did not intend for pharmacists to essentially just be pill pushers, just like doctors. So when a patient comes in, they looking for a prescription to be filled. If the pharmacist sees that the individual is nothing more than a drug addict, that they're only there for purposes of obtaining medication for their addiction, the pharmacist has a duty to notify or not fill that prescription. Again, any practitioner who issues or fills a prescription knowing that the prescription was not issued for a medical purpose, they're in violation of the law. And with that instance, the government doesn't have to show that they had a malicious motive, that they intended for anything bad to happen, that they, in fact, wanted to obtain money in any way. No, that's not the requirement. The responsibility is on the pharmacist. If they believe that the person is an addict and that they should not fill the prescription, they have a duty not to fill it. Now, what we often see in a lot of these cases is that doctors and nurses within a practice, I'm sorry, not doctors, but pharmacists and nurses within a practice may turn a blind eye. Well, the doctor issued the prescription, it must be okay. Well, something more is required from those individuals. They cannot turn a blind eye to what is obvious to the rest of us, is that that prescription is not legitimate. It shouldn't have been issued, and so they're held to a standard also. A standard that's higher than the rest of us because we don't work in the medical field. So what they're going to be looking at and what we're going to ask juries to look at is what would a reasonable nurse in this situation know? And did this nurse, maybe the defendant nurse, did she turn a blind eye to what was obvious or would have been obvious to a legitimate nurse that the prescription was not lawfully issued or it wasn't within the scope of the medical practice? Again, in a Sixth Circuit case that I read, again, this was a situation where a pharmacist had set up shop right next to the doctor. They were in the same block. It was obvious that the pharmacist and the doctor were working together. They were both prosecuted. And in the Sixth Circuit case, again, they said that a pharmacist has a duty to examine whether that prescription was legitimately issued. And he can't just rely on the fact that a prescription was presented to him. He has to do, or he or she has to do her own independent examination. Again, I spoke about nurses. This was a Second Circuit case from that's from our region, the ones that control our courts in our district. And a nurse was convicted of violating the federal drug laws because she assisted the doctor in the issuance of false prescriptions, people who didn't need these drugs. Now let's talk about the penalties. And these are really where the severity of the penalties come in when people overdose on drugs. And I can tell you that on a weekly basis, I meet with AUSAs or DEA agents in my office, and we're talking about the people that have overdosed on drugs. And we're examining those cases. DEA is taking these cases very seriously. They're making sure that these cases are treated as crime scenes. They're working with the local agencies. It's not just a situation where we're saying, well, it's a drug overdose, you know, nothing we can do about it. That's not it. We're changing the mindset of local law enforcement. And we're looking at these cases to see if there will be federal prosecutions. So I want you to know, especially for the families out there who have suffered through children, Mr. Israel obviously, other families that have been affected by overdoses, that we are taking these seriously and we will use every tool we have in the federal drug laws to prosecute these individuals. For Schedule 5 controlled substances, if you illegally dispense or distribute narcotics or controlled substances, you can serve a term of imprisonment of not more than a year. Now, if you have a second conviction, that really applies more not to doctors because presumably they will have already lost their license, but for people on the street. The next time you're convicted, it would be a maximum sentence of 4 years. For Schedule 4 controlled substances, obviously as the drugs are more serious, the penalties for those offenses go up. For the unlawful distribution of controlled or Schedule 4 controlled substances, the maximum penalty for a first offense is not more than 5 years. And if you have a prior conviction, it increases to 10 years. Now with these Schedule 4 and Schedule 5 controlled substances, there is no enhanced penalty if there is either serious bodily injury or a drug overdose. But when we get into the Schedule 3 controlled substances, there are. With Schedule 3 controlled substances, for the illegal distribution or dispensation of those narcotics, you can serve a maximum sentence of 10 years. If you have a prior conviction, the maximum sentence then goes to 15 years. And if a death or serious bodily injury results, it's 15 years. And if a person has a prior conviction, it doubles to 20 years or 30 years if a person either has serious bodily injury or an overdose. The penalties for Schedule I and Schedule II controlled substances. Now, Schedule II is the one we've talked about mostly today, the pain, the opiates like Oxycontin. The penalty for the first offense would be a 20-year maximum term of imprisonment. If death or serious bodily injury results, the minimum sentence, the mandatory minimum sentence for a person who overdoses on those pills, if you prescribe them illegally outside the bounds of your medical practice, you're facing a minimum term of imprisonment of 20 years in federal prison. And the maximum sentence is life. Now, if you get convicted of that offense and you're standing in front of the judge has no discretion. You will get 20 years in prison. All your good works, everything you did for the community, it's not going to matter. So you're mindful of that when you do have a responsibility, not only to your patients, but really to the rest of the patient's family in this community, to make sure that you are complying with your oath, that you are following through with what you were sworn to do, which is provide proper medical care to your patients to alleviate whatever their medical condition is, and really make sure that that medical condition is present and the patient is suffering from it prior to prescribing these narcotic drugs. The liability of the patient. Obviously, as Dale Kasperzak said, they have the same penalties. They have as much a role in the diversion of drugs as anyone else. They're the ones that are doctor shopping. That's why I think Attorney General Schneiderman, when he spoke today and he talked about the computer system, the internet system he wants to set up, the iStop program, that's vital. Not only is it vital to the safety of the community, but it really will assist law enforcement in weeding out, ferreting out those providers, those medical professionals who aren't complying with federal law. That's all I have for today. Obviously I'll be at the panel. I'll be happy to speak with you then or answer any questions you might have.